Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 35, entitled On Trump, the Election, the Mystery Virus, and the Great Reset. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, please pardon the delay. I enjoy these podcasts and will certainly continue making them, and probably increase the pace, but they'll always be sporadic. At times like this, with such weighty happenings occurring faster than anyone could possibly keep up, I can't help but devote my time to seeking every last bit of relevant and important context I'm able to find. It's just my nature, and I can't fight it. So, sincere apologies for those wanting rigorous consistency. I do look forward to making up the difference someday soon, provided the world slows its pace, even just a bit, in coming weeks and months. And this hectic pace is, of course, what we'll be discussing today. To set the stage, the recent election went almost exactly as I'd expected it might. Trump went into it a significant underdog, with tens of millions of Americans convinced, yet again, for some reason, by the manipulative push polls published by the press, essentially declaring that he had no chance. Even the betting markets, still a somewhat reliable barometer of public sentiment, were under this delusion, with Trump a 3-1 underdog prior to the first votes being counted. Of course, the skewing of these odds is compounded by the fact that most of those making overnight fortunes in tech or finance or similar sectors are very much Biden supporters, and most people tend to bet according to their natural political and ideological leanings. However, these odds shifted massively a few hours into election night. The polls opened with Biden up in nearly every state that mattered, and with the networks mentioning that this lead would likely dissipate, as much of it, in many states, was due to counting mail-in votes first. Sure enough, the lead did dissipate. But it didn't only disappear, it was completely obliterated. As someone that has worked with numbers and statistics and data for much of my life, there's almost an intuitive second sense that one can't help but develop over time. It'd be difficult to explain fully what I'm referring to here, but to summarize, in situations like an election in which masses of data are presented to us from all sides, it's possible to have a fairly reliable feeling as to where things are headed, as countless variables are processed, both consciously and subconsciously, to create some totality of context, painting a more complete picture. Several hours into vote counting, as most states crossed the 50% of votes counted mark, I had this feeling. The inertia was so strongly in Trump's favor, in fact, especially in most key states, that I felt near certainty. And it was about this point I started to wonder how the other side dropped the ball to such an extent. Not so much with regard to their candidate selection, or campaigning, or voting, but with regard to ballot fraud as contingency plan, and the countless number of tricks a party might engage in if they're seeking to guarantee a result. Not only is this likely the most important election in our lifetimes thus far, but anyone watching closely with some degree of objectivity has to admit that the modern Democrat Party has become one capable of almost anything to attain or maintain power. Though, in fairness, it should be added that the establishment Republicans are very close behind. So then, as if on cue, the moment I felt some confusion as to why they weren't prepared for this, the networks shifted storyline and began to announce that mail-in voting was still to be counted, and then announced this again and again and again. Meanwhile, strangely, they'd stopped tabulating new votes. The percentage reporting in most key districts hardly budged from this point forward. I could read the nervousness and anxiousness on the faces of those in network media that are traditionally in the know, who likely have the highest level connections and information sources. So I suspected something serious was happening. But for the moment, they carried on, doing their damnedest to create various path of victory predictions for Biden. Looking back, what I think probably occurred, and this is just my subjective speculation, of course, although numerous other sources seem to be now echoing a similar sentiment, is that they did have plans in place to ensure the outcome, but that the votes for Trump had exceeded, perhaps wildly exceeded, their estimates, and now they needed to buy time. Keep in mind that the betting markets were taking in the same relevant data and watching the same news feeds and we're hearing the same declaration that actually mail-in ballots hadn't yet been counted, but would very soon, and these would skew heavily towards Biden. They were watching the same television anchors and pundits doing their level best to pretend that all was going well for Biden, that despite these massive and growing gaps of 15% or better in most of the key states, with well over half the vote reporting in, that these would somehow turn blue. Even still, the betting public very much felt otherwise. So strongly, in fact, that I witnessed one of the most significant swings I've ever seen. From a 3-1 underdog, Trump was suddenly an approximately 10-1 favorite on many of the largest betting sites. Such a shift, after so much money had already been placed down to further solidify the odds in place, indicates that nearly every single bet during those several most important hours was in favor of Trump. Domestically, internationally, across every betting market. The public seemed to see the writing on the wall and know that this was essentially over. And again, this is in spite of the conditioning refrain for weeks before the election, promising a red mirage, and the network press reminding us every 5 minutes that now the mail-in ballots would be counted at the end of the process, and would, as we all knew, skew heavily for Biden. But of course, it was at this point that most of those counting the ballots in states like Pennsylvania were sent home. And from what numerous first-hand sources report, a small group of individuals then re-entered in more than one location and continued to count throughout the night. At this point, all became clear, and I felt all but certain about where we were headed and what we were in for. A very slow, long, and drawn-out, quote, ballot counting process that would find just enough votes to secure a Biden victory in states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada. This was going to be dirty, and they were all in. I'd love to go into depth regarding the definitive and specific instances of fraud, big and small, but I think many of you are already aware, and those who aren't probably will be very soon, and I'd rather not see this podcast removed. But let's just put it this way. I strongly suspect a certain group of individuals decided, long before the election began, that Trump couldn't be allowed a second term, period, full stop, and by any means necessary. It's not just political and cultural futures at stake, but I tend to think a great many in this group fear for their very freedom, and fear prosecution in a second Trump term. So as it stands, the future of our nation hangs in the balance, and a massive battle is playing out before our eyes, and will likely continue to for weeks. The stakes are so high that things may well get extremely heated and chaotic, unless, of course, Trump decides to back down. If this happens, or if it's the case that he and his inner circle did virtually nothing in preparation for this election, to have people in key positions to watch closely, record, document, and log all goings-on around them, if either of these two inexcusable things are the case, speaking personally, I'll certainly never say another word in Trump's defense. And on that note, I wanted to say a few words about why I never jumped on the anti-Trump train to the extent that several in dissident right circles did. I know about all his connections to Adelson and other Zionist figures, his courting of nationalist and right-wing Orthodox Jews, his relationships with Kushner, Dershowitz, etc. These are serious factors worthy of consideration, along with the fact that I don't agree in the least with what seems to be his fundamental philosophy that the economy is essentially the end-all be-all measure of success and happiness and progress in a nation. And his tireless push for a multicultural empire with consumerism at its core, I think, is a recipe for disaster and painful, costly, violent failure in the long run. But having said all this, and I could add so much more, there's no conception more near and dear to me than justice. And because of this, throughout much of my life, I constantly find myself allied with the underdog, or any individual or group or idea that I think is being treated unfairly, and I do mean any. For years, I've watched as this president has been treated more unfairly, with more aggressive and manipulative bias, more emotionally unhinged hatred, than any public figure in my lifetime. I watched aggressive covert attempts by intelligence agencies and a corrupt FBI to essentially mount a coup since 2016. And do everything in their power to hamstring and destroy the man. allied with corporate and media and banking and pharmaceutical interests, and neocon armchair warmongers. A collection of the most corrupt and dishonorable characters in the Western world, buoyed by a sea of apolitical, useful idiots who've learned that to succeed, they need only give voice to these same ideas. The increasingly absurd figures and dissident circles, and I often cite Richard Spencer as an example here, engage in this strange tactic of being laser-focused on the negative aspects of Trump, without ever counterbalancing these with what I've just mentioned, namely an international alliance against him composed of the worst institutions and human beings, marching in lockstep towards the dissolving of all borders, eventually all nations, races, cultures, all freedoms and independence and sovereignty, and turning the world into a shopping mall, dominated by a small cabal of the most greedy and hollow. This alliance, and the fact that Trump was squarely in its crosshairs, shouldn't be ignored. We're currently witnessing a transparent attempt at theft of a presidential election in the most powerful nation on earth. And if it succeeds, I believe we'll have crossed a point of no return. No election from this point forward would be trusted by either party. No individual elected as a result will be viewed as fully legitimate. And the bonds of structure and order that bind us as a nation and stave off total chaos are loosed and frayed still further. And yet, it's not all bad from a broader perspective. Politically, culturally, spiritually, things have become so bad so quickly in so many contexts that engaging in small tweaks or fixes might even be a net negative in the long run. Yes, a Biden-Harris administration would make it much harder for us to communicate and make the lives of tens of millions of well-oriented people a living hell, especially if they happen to be a member of the race or religion or ideologies currently being scapegoated for all the world's problems. And anyone with any power or influence in rallying energy for this fight should consider giving it their all. But even if this theft succeeded, believing all is lost is completely wrong-headed. To manifest positive changes, sufficient energy and numbers need to be rallied. A critical mass willing to do the hard things necessary to right the ship. This has always been our foremost problem. For the first time, I'm watching as even those middle-of-the-road or entirely apolitical starting to pay close attention, and very quickly becoming deeply suspicious or outright hostile to the changes being pushed, and the individuals and institutions pushing them. The globalist and internationalist plan for the Great Reset is very real, and things like the comically farcical COVID hype, or the ever-increasing hatred expressed towards whites or Christians or those on the right, or anyone that doesn't bend the knee and bow the head in compliance, is forcing a significantly large group of individuals to be more attentive and active. We need these people. I've long felt that until we begin to see at least a handful of powerful individuals begin to move towards our side of the fence, police or sheriffs, military or special forces, lawyers, judges, it'd be almost impossible to make real progress. And as conditions become more extreme and restrictive, this forced awakening will only escalate in pace, as we're all compelled by necessity to choose a side. Many of us endure the daily hell of watching the total monopolization of organs of power and influence by an ideological subset that really does seem to want us dead and gone, and our culture destroyed, with the ground salted behind us. But know that as you endure this day in and day out, these middle-of-the-road individuals that perhaps thought they could ride this all out without taking sides are now enduring the same, and finally recognizing the ramifications. And it's essentially radicalizing many of them in unprecedented numbers. Long story very short, and I know this is a dark point, but I hope you can recognize the truth in it. There's something beautiful and freeing about having nothing to lose. When things degenerate to a point that a rock bottom nears and they can't get any worse, there really is nowhere to go but up. And when your back is up against a wall, nowhere to go but forward. It forces the hand, demands a response. When and how this manifests and what results from it remains the only question. and one we should all be working to answer, and a topic on which I personally have some very important things to say, in a video I'll post as we transition into the new year. For the moment, I'd like to leave everyone with this. In these most taxing and draining times, one of the most important things we can do right this moment is to not allow them that draining power. Practice energy conservation, for lack of a better term. Don't take every argument, especially those not likely to go anywhere, or those with people you don't know personally or care deeply about. Know your limits when it comes to media and social media, and how much you're able to tolerate before you overdose on sadness or anger or disgust. Staying informed is important for most people, but just as visually taking in an excessively ugly scene can stick in the recesses of our minds long after, dealing with excessively sick or ugly individuals or ideas has a similar gravitational effect, pulling one down into that muck and mire. If you're willing and able to make a conscious effort to surround yourself with things that make you feel healthier or happier, or fundamentally improve you in some way, weathering periods like this becomes far easier. Pulling back our perspective and realizing we're merely in an exceptionally trying transition phase of history is key. The more we're zoomed in our perspective, pretending that this or that immediate term issue is all important, or that all is lost if something specific fails to materialize, is a recipe for disaster, psychologically speaking. And it's simply not an accurate perspective. Conditions at present were designed to drain those like ourselves, especially on social media. Don't hand them that victory. And keep in mind, none of us can be truly efficient or effective or in touch with our higher nature if we're excessively stressed, anxious, angry, or stewing in any similarly draining emotion. Feeling anger right now is certainly natural. Feeling some anxiety is understandable, but balance is all important here. Being in control enough to harness these emotions, like horses harnessed to a chariot to make forward progress, to use an analogy, as opposed to constantly chasing down wild horses as they bolt off in multiple directions without discipline. Seek to be that charioteer. That's it for now, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my